Welcome back to Policy Punchline. My name is David. I'm a senior at Princeton studying economics, and I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Jason Furman, who's the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy jointly at Harvard Kennedy School and the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So Professor Furman, thanks so much for being here. I'm going to kick it off to Alice to introduce herself and to get started.
Great.
Hi, I'm Alice McCarthy. I'm a sophomore in the SPEAR department. And my first question for you is about economic policy and resilience. In your review of the Resilient Society, you discuss Bronheimer's distinction between resilience and robustness, especially in macroeconomic contexts. And given your role in shaping the economic response during the Obama administration, how do you think resilience could have played a greater role in the fiscal and monetary decisions during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009?
Sure. So it's great to be with you. I did have a chance to review Princeton professor Marcus Brunnemeyer's book, The Resilient Society, which I'd recommend to all your listeners as a really wide-ranging discussion of that issue. Say, when it came to the financial crisis, the macro consequences were worse than what we were expecting. Part of that is just that the data itself was wrong. The initial estimates of job loss and GDP growth were bad, but not horrendous. And subsequently, they got revised to horrendous. So in real time, we were looking at the data, and the data was understating just what was happening. But importantly, when you make policy, you can't make policy based on an exact understanding of what's happening. You have to make it based on a wide range of contingencies. And when it came to the Fed and the financial rescue, I think that basically happened because the Fed is very nimble and responsive and can change. And what was done to rescue the banks was very nimble and responsive and could change. What was not nimble and responsive was the Congress. And so the fiscal response was originally passed in February 2009. It was based on a smaller crisis than what we had. And then you'd think when the crisis was bigger, you'd come back and do something bigger and do even more. But instead, the Congress basically had this attitude of, oh, we did this fiscal stimulus. The problem is still there. It must be that the fiscal stimulus didn't work. We don't want any more of it. And so what I wish we had done was something more like automatic stabilizers, build in a formula that as long as the unemployment rate went up, stayed elevated, additional money would go out, whether to states or unemployed or individuals or whatever it is. And so building in more formulas, more automatic stabilizers, less reliance on discretion by Congress is what I really wish we had done and what I think the lesson for the future is.
Yeah, completely. And following on from that, you argued that too robust a fiscal response might create long-term vulnerabilities like inflation or debt crises. Do you think that ARRA could have been scaled differently to build more long-term resilience without triggering the vulnerabilities we saw during COVID-19?
Yeah. So are you talking about the American Rescue Plan and the one that we did in 2021 or not the financial crisis? So in 2021, yes, I think we did the American Rescue Plan. And yes, I think it was too large. And you could see that one of two ways. Either you could add up the needs. How much money did states need? How much money did people need? How much money was needed to fill various holes? And it just wasn't that much money. States were running pretty healthy fiscal situation. Households had more money in their bank accounts than usual. Or you could do a top-down macro analysis. How big is the output gap? How big is the fiscal multiplier? How much money is needed to fill the macro need? And both of those methods came up with something quite small. At a minimum, I wasn't sure that we'd get a lot of inflation from it, but at a minimum, I thought we were basically wasting money. And why do you want to spend trillions of dollars for something that is ephemeral? There's nothing in the year 2024 that's different because of the money that was spent. We spent $2 trillion and we didn't get universal preschool. We didn't get a long-term reduction in child poverty. We didn't get anything like that. And then the second thing is there was the risk of inflation, which basically is what happens when you try to enable people to consume more than the economy can produce. The way those two get reconciled is inflation. Going back, I think ironically the same, or not ironically, but whatever word you want to use, the same answer that would have been right in the financial crisis would have worked here. If you had formulas that tied the level of assistance to the unemployment rate, those formulas would have seen that the unemployment rate was falling very, very rapidly. And as a result, would have reduced the amount of assistance much more quickly than Congress did. And in some sense, I think it's not an accident that one time we made the mistake of doing too little in the financial crisis, and then we overcompensated in COVID and did too much. And frankly, I'm worried that in the next crisis, that I'm more worried that we're going to do too little than that we're going to do too much.
Yeah, completely. I think that's definitely a risk that's hopefully not going to come to fruition. And turning to more macroeconomic stability, in the same review of the Resilient Society, you highlight the risk of minimizing business cycle fluctuations at the expense of innovation. And looking back to the 2008 crisis response, do you think the measures taken, like the stimulus spending and like the tax incentives, may have stifled longer-term economic dynamism in any way?
Look, some reallocation can be good for productivity. I wonder, Europe prevented large employment losses during COVID, and Europe is currently having very slow productivity growth. The United States had a lot of employment losses, a lot of labor reallocation where people shift jobs, shifted employers, and it's better productivity growth. I do wonder if those two are linked to each other. Sometimes some reallocation, some dynamism does involve churn. The financial crisis, though, was just a massive thing that went way beyond anything that had any useful purpose for innovation or dynamism. In fact, it got in the way of research and development, of investment, of other things. And so I think that is much more likely to have created a long-term drag on growth rather than any sort of innovation. And the main solution to that, the main way to get out of that drag on growth, would have been more short-term stimulus, which would paradoxically have helped long-term growth too by, enabling, not having cutbacks on innovation, for example.
Thanks so much. I guess one, I'm sure you've heard a lot of anecdata, but one kind of interesting experience during the, pandemic stimulus was I had just left the Army March 1st, 2020. So extremely coincidentally timed. And when you leave the Army, it's equivalent to, I guess, a layoff in terms of your eligibility for unemployment. And I just, I think at least a year, every week I would get these huge, the normal unemployment plus the bonus unemployment. And I guess I had a pretty high marginal propensity to spend. I spent a lot of it. I kind of was thinking this might be inflationary. And I even came to the point where I had a pretty decent job offer. And I would still be making a slightly less than I would be with the unemployment. And I thought about it and I said, well, I should take it because it's good for my career. But I think then I kind of was thinking that this would be, I'm not the only one having this experience. This is kind of reducing labor supply while, supercharging demand, even as some of the health consequences began to wane. So just kind of a personal experience where I think maybe saw inflation a little bit early, just for my own experience. But I guess that squares with the data and with the kind of macroeconomic indicators that were observed.
Yeah, look, first of all, anecdata can be useful. It's useful doing statistical work. You don't want to generalize too much from any anecdote you hear. But I do think when you want to understand the world, you want to combine different ways of knowing. A bit of common sense, some anecdotes, look at the data, mix it all up together. And in 2020, unemployment insurance ended up designed so that most people receiving it were getting more money from unemployment insurance than they would get from work. This is sometimes called the replacement rate, what fraction of your previous salary was being replaced. And normally for a moderate income person, that's about 50%. If you lose your job, you get about half that back in unemployment insurance. And so you'd like to get back to a job because it's hard to living on 50% of your salary. During COVID, it was often 150%. Now, at first, I think that's not a problem. That definitely discourages work. Economists call it moral hazard, but we didn't necessarily want everyone showing up at work in the year 2020 in March, April, May, and the like. And so in some sense, I think it actually was designed to reduce work and did reduce work. Where I think it became more problematic was in some states, it continued through September 2021. And if the Biden administration had gotten their way, they'd originally proposed it would go through December 2021. And by then, workplaces were much safer. Vaccines were available. There were tons of job openings. And even though we had reduced unemployment insurance a little bit, still a lot of people were getting a replacement rate of above 100%. And I think at that stage of the pandemic and pandemic recovery, it actually stunted employment growth. And because of that led to inflation. Normally, if people aren't employed, you don't get inflation. But if those people who aren't employed can also, like you were, David, spend money, then you can get inflation. So I think that is a good example of something that initially made sense, but then outlasted the rationale for it by quite a large margin. And by the way, I think the Biden administration understood that because red states dropped the bonus unemployment insurance before it ended. They started dropping, I think, in June and July of 2021, even though it ended in September. And the Biden administration did not object to that because I think they basically understood this is keeping people from working. There's no excuse for that anymore, by and large. And, we secretly might even have been happy that some states were ending it.
A lot of sense. In your interview with Tyler Cowen, he asked you which macro indicators do you think are less meaningful? And you mentioned GDP, you mentioned inflation, you mentioned the quality of healthcare being difficult to measure. So I guess, what's your opinion on the kind of best and least helpful economic indicators that we have right now? And then what would you change to make them more useful?
Yeah, so best and least useful depends on what use it's for. In some low frequency sense, GDP is incredibly useful. We know the difference between the United States, China, and India today. We know their differences 20 years ago. We know their differences 50 years ago. And that's almost the only piece of data I'd look at for that type of big picture, low frequency comparison. If you look at a very high frequency, what's happening right now, GDP isn't that well measured in real time. It gets heavily revised. So for example, in 2022, we had 2 quarters in a row of negative growth in the original reports. One of those has since been revised to positive. So this technical recession has gone away in the revision. In real time, I would have said the jobs numbers are the best way to understand the economy sort of month to month. You get them a week after the month ends. They're a very large sample. But they've had a lot of problems recently too. They've had big revisions. The revisions have all been in one direction, which is to the negative. Immigration issues and measurement have compounded problems with understanding what was going on with them as well. But I still think you probably can't. You can't improve on the jobs numbers, but you have to take them with maybe a bigger grain of salt than you used to.
Got it. Thank you so much. I think actually a really quick follow-up. I guess, if there's no good answer, that's totally fine. But is there any, real kind of concrete methodologically, like increasing the sample size or, readjusting how different regions, or is there any kind of on the ground thing that really could make a big difference? Or you think we're basically doing the best that we can?
I mean, with the money, the statistical agencies are just outstanding in the United States. They provide a much richer set of data much more quickly than you see in other countries. All the labor market data we have is just really, really rich compared to what is produced by, for example, on the European Union or the UK. So I think the main constraint is the budget. And if they had more budget, they could have a larger sample size. And with a larger sample size, everything would be more accurate. There is an issue, though, that people respond, not people, businesses, these are businesses mainly, respond less to surveys than they used to. People do as well. This has been a problem for political polling. It's a problem for economic data as well. And I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that is. The last thing I'd say is the statistical agencies have been slow to combine big data with survey data. And that, I think, will be the future of more accurate statistics. Big data by itself does not work. You can't just look at credit card spend to figure out consumer spending, because if consumers have a trend of using more credit cards or less credit cards, that'll look like a change in the actual spending. So you need some type of benchmark that comes from surveys, and then you can combine that month to month with credit card data and with, more resources and more time. I hope that's something that they master and improves on all of this.
Thank you.
Now, turning back to healthcare, but kind of separate from COVID, the US healthcare system is clearly flawed, as you note in your article, Starting Health Reform from Here, with 26 million Americans being uninsured, despite healthcare expenditures coming in at 17% of the GDP, which is the highest of any OECD country. In your article, you favor incremental reforms over the radical overhaul proposed by Enavs and Finkelstein. During your time helping design the Affordable Care Act, what incremental reforms did you support? And were there any radical proposals that you felt had merit, but were just politically unfeasible?
Yeah. So there's two arguments for incremental reform in healthcare. One is a political one, that there'll just be too many people objecting. And Bill Clinton tried a big health reform in 1993. It got defeated. And part of why it got defeated was it was probably trying to make too many changes at once. And that stirred up too many interest groups and opposition. And so it didn't happen. But there's a second reason too, which is I am, and I think any policymaker should be, a bit of a small c conservative. You don't quite know what your changes are going to result in. All sorts of unintended consequences, things you didn't anticipate and don't understand, could happen as a result of change. And so building incrementally on the current system, you can be more confident you're going in the right direction rather than going in the wrong direction. If you take a leap, you might get lucky and end up in a much better system, but you also might get unlucky and mess everything up and end up in a worse place. So I like the idea of iterating over time on substance grounds as well. Broadly, I believe the philosophy that had been pioneered in the state of Massachusetts that was underlying the Affordable Care Act, which is a combination of requiring people to have coverage and providing a marketplace for plans and having a set of regulations that you couldn't discriminate against people based on pre-existing conditions and things like that. So I think broadly speaking, that was the right approach. I myself at the time, and still do, had sort of one of the wrinkles on the whole thing I liked was income-related cost sharing. I'd written a paper that documented by saying that low-income people would not have to pay anything towards their healthcare, but high-income people would have to pay, co-pays or co-insurance or deductibles or whatever it is. That could work quite well in aligning people's incentives, getting them to use less unnecessary care. And that was something that we did incorporate into the design of the Affordable Care Act. And, it's not a panacea for the world's problems. It's not going to make the United States health system as good and effective as many others in the world. But, I think every little bit helps.
Yeah, going off that, the Round health insurance experiment found that cost sharing could reduce spending by 30% without worsening our health outcomes. How do you think policymakers can best communicate these benefits to the public who may just see cost sharing as another financial burden?
Yeah. I mean, the problem with everything in health is we actually do know things that reduce costs and don't reduce outcomes. Cost sharing is one of them. Narrow networks where you don't have much choice of doctors is a second one. Things like health maintenance organizations that are very strict. If you want to see a specialist, you have to go to a primary care physician and get a referral first, for example. Those also can save costs, but people hate all of these. And, one way to think about that is when people are buying healthcare, they're partly buying a longer, healthier life, and they're also partly buying a set of amenities. And it's fine to want to spend more on amenities. When I go to a hotel, I do not find the very, very cheapest hotel, even though the very cheapest hotel still has a bed and a bathroom and accomplishes the purpose of a hotel. And you could say the same in health. The difference between health and hotels is hotels, I can look and one of them's $200 a night and the other's $300 a night. And I can say, is the extra $100 worth it to me? With healthcare, you don't really know how you're paying, in part because a lot of how you're paying is your employer pays a higher premium and then they give you less of a salary and you don't quite see the link. Or the government pays for something and you pay higher taxes and you don't quite see the link. And so with something like cost sharing, the right way to think about it is, do you want to pay an upfront larger premium and then have lower cost sharing, or an upfront lower premium and then have higher cost sharing? It's not differences in the amount of money necessarily. It's differences in when and how you pay, but you're not really noticing your premium and you are noticing those out-of-pocket payments. And so it makes it hard, I think, for individuals to make, good choices in terms of what they want from their employer, what they want from their government, or how they feel about any of it. And so ultimately, I do think having better solutions to health issues is going to require some way of connecting the cost for people in a way that they can see and understand and make better choices about.
Yes, completely. And building off the kind of use of economic models in policymaking, in your review of Elizabeth Furman's Thinking Like an Economist, you note that economics has become the dominant framework for policy decisions, but you seem to argue that policymakers often misuse or selectively apply this economic analysis. How do you think we can ensure that economic models are applied more rigorously and transparently in policymaking?
Yeah, so I think it's a constant struggle. I mean, everyone is tempted by confirmation bias, by building a model to deliver the answer they already thought was true, rather than sort of following and believing the model. Part of this, I think, has institutional solutions. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office is very independent-minded. It's very nonpartisan. It's very expert. They can definitely be wrong, but they're not biased. They're not always wrong in one direction or the other. And so relying on them for your analysis of how much something costs in the budget, or in the case of health insurance, how many people are covered, I think is a lot better than shopping around for your favorite think tank advocacy group and using numbers that they, may have made up or, had some type of biased model. And there's other countries that have that. In the UK, there's the Office of Budget Responsibility. And by the way, when Prime Minister Liz Truss ignored that office 2 years ago, the market was swift and vicious in its verdict. And a lot of that was a response to, not wanting politicians using their own models, wanting them to use these respected ones. So partly it's institutional. I do think viewpoint diversity is important in economics. I would much rather have, people who are either nonpartisan, or if they're going to be partisan, have people who sort of love government and think it can do a great job, which tend to be Democrats, and people who sort of are very skeptical of government and notice all the ways in which it messes up and creates bad assumptions, bad incentives, and they tend to be Republicans. I think the process of them debating stuff and kicking the tires is more likely to uncover a mistake in a model than just Democrats alone. If you're passionate about poverty, let's say, I think you don't want just Democrats thinking about the topic because they're going to make a bunch of mistakes because they have a systematic set of blind spots. You really want some Republicans in the room to help say, oh, what will this do to incentives, for example, which might be a topic that was under-addressed. And then finally, just acknowledge there's not going to be a great answer to this. There's always going to be uncertainty. And so you try to build policies could be a little bit more robust. They work, under not just one theory, but under 5 different theories. And maybe you make it, maximize the minimum, in the worst possible outcome, it's still pretty okay, or however else you want to cope with risk.
I think, going off that kind of process of policy making in regard to in defense of the dismal science and the discussion you had about it with Ezra Klein on his podcast. And this may be a reductionist view, and I'd like you to push back if you think so. But when I read that speech, to me, the core argument sounded like people should be more honest. They should be more honest about trade-offs. They should be more honest about the magnitudes of the costs, let's say in the conservative case, or the sign of the costs that maybe in the more liberal case are looked at as benefits. And I guess the question is, do you think that's generally an okay synthesis, is be more honest? And then in cases when those mistakes are made, how confident are we that they may actually, are they real analytical errors, or are they people that have given up on analysis and are kind of almost making a dishonest, or at least a case that's disinterested from analytical rigor and more just they have an outcome that they want and that's it?
Yeah. It's always been the case that a lot of people sort of know the answer and then find the evidence for that answer. And in this speech, I laid out what I thought was the liberal vice of saying all good things go together. I want to tackle climate change. And here's the great thing. By doing it, I'm going to create lots of green jobs and increase economic growth. Then there's the conservative vice, which says, exaggerates magnitudes. You want to address climate change? You have this new regulation that's going to destroy the economy and destroy economic growth. Don't do it. When the reality of most regulations to address climate change is they actually are bad for the economy. But in a lot of cases, it's only a small bad. And that small bad is outweighed by the benefit of reducing carbon emissions. And you need to decide which regulations are good because the benefit of reducing carbon emissions outweighs the cost of the regulation, and which ones are bad because the regulation is just too costly. And that process is a technocratic process. Not, everyone loves to think that way. I don't know that it's dishonesty in the sense that people are knowingly lying, but it's not what I would say is sort of an unbiased obsession with searching for the truth, with being contrarian, with constantly trying to kick at your own prejudices and preconceptions. And look, it's tricky to say that the answer depends. I don't have a single template to answer every question. I have a cost-benefit analysis, and it's going to come up with different answers depending on, what the question is. And by the way, the answers will change over time, and the answers are debatable depending on how you do the analysis. And that's in some ways, more difficult way to live, but I think that's the right way to live. And the nice thing about it is I also do think that a technocratic approach to public policy, to the degree possible, gives voice to people that are otherwise voiceless in the process. If you're in government, the people who come in and want something, they know exactly how it will affect them. The people who are affected by it don't come in and talk to you. So if it's a trade restriction, the factory that got the tariff, you hear from them. You don't hear from the people who are paying more, or you don't hear from the other workers who used, whatever that factory was making as an input and now will have a harder time getting jobs. If it's student loan debt relief, that sounds really nice for the people that benefited from it. But what about the extra inflation it will cause? Do you hear from those people? What about the way in which it will drive up interest rates and raise the cost of mortgages? Do you hear from those people? What about the way it will affect the budget in the future? Do you hear from those people? Getting the analysis right is a way of bringing all the voices into the process and into the decision, many of whom you would never hear from otherwise.
Exactly. Do you think there's any, obviously different institutions, different think tanks, maybe different university departments or professors have different reputations. Do you think there's any way, and maybe, I saw some of your recent posting on prediction markets. I'm very into prediction markets. We had the CEO of Kalshi on here a while ago. And maybe a prediction market could be part of this, but do you think there's any way to maybe formalize a track record or a reputation? Forecasters will say things and then they do or do not happen. But it seems like we don't have a great repository of, hey, did this person generally get things right? If they've had a 30-year career, how does that look? Do you think there could be any virtue in that idea, or do you see any practical steps to implement something like that?
Look, I try to do that. People who claim to have called everything right in the macroeconomy over the last 4 years almost invariably have a very, very selective memory of their calls. So they're not geniuses who knew every up and down. No one called every up and down. And I trust people who tell me about the errors they made over the last 4 years, not people who tell me that they were right about every single thing. I think another thing that people have a terrible track record on is confidence intervals around their forecast. If you look, the survey of professional forecasters, which is the leading forecasters, in May of 2021, asked people what inflation would be. They said 2%. I mean, the forecaster said 2%. That was a little crazy, but whatever. But here's what was really nuts. They said the chances it would be above 4% would be less than 0.5%. And it ended up above 5%. And if that was the one time they made that error, it would be okay, but it happens year after year. They say there's a 90% chance growth is in this range, and it falls outside of that range more than 10% of the time. And so people are just systematically biased towards having smaller confidence intervals, which gets to the overconfidence that people have, which gets to the people who think they were right about everything because they have a selective memory. It sort of reminds me of my grandmother, who would go to the casino to gamble. And, I'd ask her, aren't you losing money by gambling? Isn't this a bad thing to do? And she's, oh no, 3 weeks ago I made money. And then there was that time 4 months ago I made money. And the other time I made money, she could tell you like the date, chapter, verse of every time she'd made money at the casino. And I think she was telling me the truth. She just was omitting, a whole bunch of other times she had been to the casino and how it all averaged out. So, David, I like something like your idea. I don't quite know how to do it, but I try to do it with people and at the very least, try to do it with yourself. And the way you can do it with yourself is by putting down numbers and probabilities. To say a soft landing is likely. What's a soft landing? What's likely? Okay, a soft landing, I'm going to define it as the unemployment rate is below 4.5 and inflation is below 2.5. And that happens before such and such date. And there's a 60% chance of it. Great. Now we know what you're talking about. We can evaluate it and we can have conversations, by the way. You say, we won't definitely have a soft landing. I say, we'll probably have a soft landing. Are we disagreeing with each other? Are we agreeing with each other? If you say 60% and I say 62%, then we know we're basically agreeing. So I think numbers and probabilities help a lot. Not that they're true and accurate, but just that they're much better than words, which we just don't know what they mean.
And I think, one virtue of prediction markets, right, is that the magnitude of I don't know if bet is the right word, but the magnitude of capital at risk should signal something about confidence, right? Like seems like there's a good way to maybe aggregate people's opinion with their money on the line. But kind of moving on a little bit to monetary policy, I saw your dissertation with kind of money macro, and I want to think back over the last few years, or maybe even just also look forward. Recently we saw the Fed start to lower interest rates, but we also saw the 10-year move in the opposite direction. And especially, since late September. And if I think about transmission mechanisms, I think a lot about things that do involve long rates. And I guess the counterfactual is, without those rate cuts, maybe long rates would be even higher. Maybe there's some other things going on there, but I'd love to kind of hear your opinion of how people's thinking is being updated on transmission mechanisms, what you think the most important are, and the situation we're in now where there is, long rates and short rates maybe moving in opposite directions and how that affects the transmission mechanisms.
Yeah. So what we've been seeing is the Fed realized that it was probably in the wrong place for where the economy was. Inflation had come down a lot. The unemployment rate had increased a little bit. And for 14 months, they kept the Fed funds rate the same. And so I think it made sense to lower the Fed funds rate. But as you just noted correctly, what matters for the market is what's the interest rate on corporate debt? What's the interest rate on mortgages? What's the value of the dollar? Those types of variables. And they have, in some sense, a mind of their own. They're thinking not just about the Fed today, but the Fed tomorrow and inflation tomorrow and all of that. And one factor is the rise and then ultimate election of Donald Trump led people to think there would be, for example, more fiscal expansion, which drives up interest rates, drives up inflation. And you've seen that reflected in the market. I don't think this leads to any change in thinking. We've always understood that things like mortgage rates that matter for the economy depend on the anticipation. So even before the Fed raised rates very much in 2021, mortgage rates jumped a lot in anticipation of the rate increases. And then there were some people I know who were like, oh, mortgage rates went up, so the Fed doesn't need to cut rates. I'm like, no, that's nuts. The whole reason they went up is because they're expecting them to raise rates. If they don't follow through on it, they'll go back down again. Here it was the reverse. Mortgage rates initially started to come down because of the expectation of rate cuts, but then those expectation of rate cuts got ratcheted back, and people thought there'd still be some, just not as many. And so mortgage rates went back up. And all of this illustrates that, I obsess over the Fed. Everyone obsesses over the Fed. Most of what the Fed does is take reality as given and ratify it rather than create a new reality. A lot of people are bothered by how low interest rates were for a long time. That wasn't the Fed's fault. That was the structure of the economy at that moment the Fed was accepting. A lot of people are bothered now that interest rates are stuck high. Again, the Fed is accepting that reality. And if the market decides the Fed's not going to cut as much next year and the year after, there's not a whole lot the Fed can do to convince it otherwise.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to hand it over to Alice, and then I'll try to wrap up maybe one last question after she's done.
My final question is looking more to the future. You've been part of the partnership on artificial intelligence to benefit people in society. And given the rapid development of AI today, what economic policies do you believe are necessary to ensure that AI contributes to economic growth whilst mitigating risks like job displacement and inequality?
Yeah. First of all, I think AI could be an incredible thing. I'm not positive how well it's going to pan out. There's worry that progress on generative AI is slowing, but the upside is just enormous for health, for solving climate change, even if it uses a lot of energy, for wages, for education, for all sorts of things. And so I think our orientation should be, how do we get more of it? Now, it has some downsides. It might cause job displacement. The solutions to that, I think, are mostly outside of AI. It's not like you go to the people writing the code and say, write the code in a different way so it doesn't displace jobs. They don't quite know how to write the code in a way that doesn't displace jobs. And by the way, job displacement is part of why you get all those good things that I was talking about before. So many of the problems need to be addressed outside of AI with, for example, more progressive tax and transfer systems, better education. I think community college can play a big role. For older workers that are displaced, I think something like wage insurance, which is like unemployment insurance, but you get it even if you get a new job, just if your new job pays less than your old job. And so these types of, to some degree, social safety net, but also helping and encouraging people to get jobs and to connect to jobs. I think that's where a lot of the answer lies. And overreaction would, I think, you'd lose too much of the good from AI and not even necessarily effectively limit the bad so much.
And I guess kind of one last two-parter, but the last one is super short. You're a professor, right? And you teach famously Harvard's Ec 10. So how do you think about students in your class or in other classes using generative AI as either a tutor that'll help them learn the material even better, or as a crutch to do the PSET and really think about the material even less? And then I'll ask my kind of punchline question at the end. Is very, very short, I promise.
Great. So I think this is in some ways a little bit like the answer to Alice. AI, I think it's just upside if you use it correctly and incorporate it correctly. So we have great TFs in my class, but to have a TF that was available 24 hours a day and was never judgmental and you weren't embarrassed to ask stupid questions in front of, and there's no such thing as a stupid question, but this is better or worse question. I think that would be great for people. Having, our students, we give them a lot of practice tests. They'd love even more practice tests. Having AI that can generate unlimited number of questions, give you feedback. So I think there's tremendous opportunities for learning. And to wish it away, first of all, is unrealistic. You can't make it go away. But second of all, it's great. But absolutely, you need to make changes. We used to have an essay in our class. It wasn't that important to our class. It was just a way of sending a message that economics isn't just problem sets. It's about thinking out the world. We decided to drop the essay in a class of 750 people. I don't think we could have established the norm of not using generative AI or catch people doing it. Well, that makes me a little bit sad, but it's not the worst thing. If an essay was really important, We could have had it on a blue book exam, but it wasn't that important. So we didn't do that. So maybe some things move in class. Some things involve learning how to use it. And look, if you're going to use it to look up every single thing, you're not going to get very far because you can't constantly be looking things up. But you can use it to look up some things and complement your thinking. And so just like, SAT tests have a part that you can use a calculator and a part that you can't, that's the direction that learning should go in as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Before I ask the final question, Tyler Cowen said it on his podcast, and we spoke a little bit here about honesty and integrity. And I think, and many others think that you are just a paragon of that in the field. I think people trust you on every side. Tyler Cowen called you, I think, the world's greatest living economist. And I think I and certainly a lot of other people agree with that. So what's next for you? What's your next project? What's your next book, paper? What do you want to do next?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book that fleshes out what was in that speech in defense of the dismal science and makes this argument, but twofold argument. One, that economics is this rich, powerful thing that if you care about inequality, you care about climate change, it has tools that help you think about that. But two, if you care about inequality, you care about climate change, whatever it is you care about, you do want to take trade-offs seriously. You do want to take budget constraints seriously. You do want to think about it carefully. And just fleshing out that broad message. So it's almost like a manifesto for people who want to think in that manner.
Beautiful. Can't wait to read it. Professor Furman, thank you so much. It was great to speak with you.
Thanks to both of you for this great conversation. And I'm impressed about how well you did your homework.
Thank you so much for going on the show.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.